Our Sister Killjoy, or Reflections from a Black-Eyed Squint, published in 1977, marks the debut novel of Ghanaian writer Ama-Ata Aidoo, a celebrated feminist, playwright, and poet. A complex, experimental work blending prose, poetry, and political critique, the novel follows the journey of a young Ghanaian woman named Sissy who travels to Europe on a scholarship. Far from a conventional narrative of self-discovery, Our Sister Killjoy dismantles romanticized notions of the West, interrogates neocolonialism, and critiques the alienation of African intellectuals abroad. Aidoo crafts a sharp, ironic, and genre-defying narrative that confronts issues of race, gender, sexuality, migration, and post-colonial identity. Setting and structure. The novel takes place primarily in Germany, with brief sojourns in England and other parts of Europe, but its ideological heart remains in Ghana and post-colonial Africa. Divided into 4 sections, Into a Bad Dream, The Plums, The Peace of Men, and A Love Letter, the book blends narrative with internal monologue and poetic interludes. The narrator, Sissy, is a highly educated, politically conscious Ghanaian woman. Her perspective drives the novel's critical lens. As she travels through Europe, her observations, often sarcastic or laced with disillusionment, form the foundation of the novel's broader critique of colonial legacies and misguided African aspirations. Part 1. Into a Bad Dream. Sissy arrives in Germany through an academic or government-sponsored program meant to build future leaders of Africa. Almost immediately, she feels out of place, alienated by the coldness of German society and skeptical of the political motives behind such programs. She is hosted by Maren, a white German woman who seems to embody liberal European hospitality. However, Sissy quickly grows uneasy, sensing a superficial understanding of Africa and patronizing undertones in Maren's friendliness. This section reveals Sissy's early discomfort with the European gaze and introduces one of the novel's central tensions: the exploitation of African identity through Western exoticism, philanthropy, and institutionalized control. Part 2. The Plums. This section focuses on Sissy's observations of fellow Africans, especially men, who have migrated to Europe and adapted, or submitted, to Western norms. Many are depicted as having forsaken their roots, ashamed of Africa, and desperate to assimilate into a society that views them as inferior. Through encounters with individuals who prioritize economic survival over cultural or political integrity, Sissy becomes more critical of the post-colonial condition and the failure of African leadership to instill genuine self-pride. She is particularly disturbed by an African man who has married a German woman and openly disparages African women, portraying them as backward and undesirable. His internalized racism and gender bias deeply offend Sissy, reinforcing her skepticism of migration as a solution for Africa's problems. Part 3. The Peace of Men. This section contains some of the novel's most searing political commentary. Sissy's critique now expands to target neocolonialism, Western complicity in African underdevelopment, and the betrayal of nationalist ideals by African elites. Aidoo portrays the post-independence African state as compromised and complicit, dependent on European aid and ideology. Sissy scorns the bureaucrats and intellectuals who travel abroad for training and then return home not to serve their communities, but to perpetuate corruption and inequality. The title, The Peace of Men, is ironic, referring to the false stability maintained through subservience, silence, and the oppression of both women and the marginalized. Part 4. A Love Letter. This final section takes the form of a lyrical, epistolary monologue, a letter Sissy writes to Maria, a mysterious woman with whom she shared an emotionally intense, possibly romantic connection. The relationship is never explicitly defined, but it is suggestive of a same-sex emotional or romantic bond, making this one of the earliest African novels to address queer themes, albeit obliquely. In this letter, Sissy reflects on desire, repression, identity, and belonging. Her affection for Maria contrasts sharply with her disdain for the exploitative relationships she witnessed among African men and European women. Yet, even in this intimate connection, Sissy maintains a critical distance, ever alert to the imbalance of power and cultural misunderstanding. The novel ends not with closure, but with recommitment to Africa, as Sissy prepares to return home, not because she feels fulfilled or optimistic, but because she believes in the necessity of engaged, critical participation in her country's future. Analysis. 1. A revolutionary narrative form. Our sister Killjoy defies traditional novelistic conventions. It blends poetry, prose, interior monologue, and political essay, creating a hybrid structure that mirrors Sissy's fragmented sense of identity and ideological discomfort. The poetic interludes often interrupt the narrative to provide lyrical reflections, sometimes angry, sometimes tender. These disruptions challenge readers to rethink the very nature of storytelling and to recognize that African experience cannot be contained within Western literary forms. The fragmentation also reflects the diasporic condition, displaced, disjointed, and in constant negotiation with multiple worlds. 2. Post-colonial critique and neocolonialism. At its core, the novel is a scathing post-colonial critique. Aidoo exposes the contradictions of Africa's independence, which, in her view, has led to a new form of enslavement, economic dependency, cultural alienation, and political mimicry. The African bureaucrats and technocrats in the novel have replaced colonial administrators but continue to uphold foreign systems. Western aid programs are shown not as altruistic but as strategic tools of influence, designed to shape African minds in ways that serve global capitalism. Sissy's refusal to be grateful or compliant makes her a killjoy, a disruptor of polite illusions, a voice that disturbs both Africans and Europeans who prefer comforting lies. 3. Feminism and gender politics. Aidoo, a pioneering feminist voice, uses Sissy to critique gender roles in both African and European societies. While African men abroad are portrayed as desperate to claim European women, often discarding African women in the process, Sissy resists these dynamics. She exposes how patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism intersect to control women's bodies and limit their roles. Her refusal to engage in romantic or sexual entanglements on European terms is a feminist assertion of agency. The love letter to Maria, though ambiguous, introduces female desire, possibly same-sex desire, as a site of authenticity and emotional depth in contrast to the exploitative heterosexual relationships depicted earlier. 4. Language and irony. Aidoo's language is rich, biting, and ironic. Sissy's voice oscillates between sarcastic humor and searing critique. She mocks the absurdities of development programs, the ignorance of white liberals, and the hypocrisy of African leaders. This ironic tone is not meant to entertain but to disarm and provoke. Sissy does not spare herself either. Her critical eye is turned inward as much as outward, creating a deeply self-aware narrative. 5. Identity, exile, and return. The novel complicates the idea of exile as a romantic or liberatory condition. Sissy's journey abroad is filled with discomfort and disillusionment. Unlike the narrative of the fortunate migrant, Sissy finds Europe spiritually barren and politically oppressive. Her decision to return to Africa is not triumphant but defiant. She chooses engagement over escape, critique over complicity. Her return is a political statement. The fight for Africa's soul must be waged from within. 6. Queer subtext and emotional complexity. Though never explicitly defined, Sissy's relationship with Maria adds a subtle but powerful queer dimension to the novel. This emotional attachment transcends physicality and gestures toward an alternative form of intimacy, one not shaped by colonial binaries or patriarchal roles. This is radical in the African literary landscape of the 1970s, where queer identities were almost entirely absent or demonized. Aidoo offers space, however tentative, for emotional and sexual complexity that resists easy categorization. Conclusion: Our Sister Killjoy is a landmark African novel, formally innovative, politically radical, and emotionally complex. Through the character of Sissy, Ama-Ata Aidoo dismantles myths about the West, challenges the failure of post-independence African leadership, and calls for a feminist, Pan-African reawakening. The novel's fragmented style, poetic voice, and critical edge refuse easy answers. It asks readers to confront uncomfortable truths about power, identity, race, and the costs of assimilation. In doing so, Aidoo establishes herself as not just a storyteller, but a revolutionary thinker whose words remain urgently relevant today. Sissy, the Killjoy, emerges not as a cynic, but as a moral compass, a woman unafraid to ask hard questions, to love on her own terms, and to return home with her eyes wide open. Through her, Aidoo delivers a powerful message. Africa's future depends not on borrowed dreams, but on the courage to speak, question, and rebuild from within.